Hi everyone, welcome to part 2. Okay, Euwe has just played rook d8 and Fischer continued with queen e3. Queen takes b5 is the best move available to black. So rook takes b5 and now rook d7 is how Euwe chose to meet the threat of rook b7 check, winning the a pawn. But Fritz is of the opinion that pushing the pawn to a6 was better and now gives white a small edge, whereas before this move he assessed the position as equal. So king e2 is how Fischer continued. He can play rook a5 instead, winning the a pawn immediately, but Fischer writes that this is unnecessary as it can be won at white's leisure because black has no further way to defend it, and Fritz agrees that this move would lose white the edge that he had in the position. So king e2 and now f6, rook d1, which is another nice move from Fischer. His idea is to swap off black's only active piece, which is more or less positionally forced anyway. Not to trade is significantly worse for black. So rook takes d1, king takes d1, and at move 20 we're already in an endgame situation, and now the fact that black lost castling rights in the opening is proving to be a decisive factor. White's greater activity and the fact that he can win black's a-pawn whenever he chooses gives him a very strong game here, and essentially means that black is playing for a draw. Euwe continued with king d7. So, what's the best way to continue here for white? If you want to try and spot it, then stop the video now. Rook b8 is what Fischer played, again leaving the a-pawn because there's more to be had in the position. This pins the bishop and gives black a lot of problems to solve before he can even consider trying to get any initiative or activity. If instead bishop takes a7, now bishop d6, rook b7 check, king c6, rook takes g7, bishop takes h2, for example, and in this position Fischer writes it would be very hard for white to win. It's easy enough for black to hold for a draw. After his move rook b8, the threat is bishop c5, winning a piece and the game, and Euwe dealt with this by playing king c6. So now Fischer finally took the a-pawn, which creates a decisive passed a-pawn of his own, and Euwe has to do something about the inactivity of his pieces, and he chose the quickest way out with g5. So Fischer immediately pushed the passed pawn, and now Euwe played bishop g7, hoping perhaps for a rook exchange, but Fischer wasn't so keen because there's more initiative to be had and pressure to build in the position, with rook b6 check, threatening to win e6, so king d5 is forced. If king d7, then rook b7 check wins the bishop, and Fischer made that threat now anyway on the bishop. So Euwe played bishop f8, and now came rook b8, where Fischer writes he was still trying to decide how to squeeze the most out of the position. It's not a repeated position because the last time he played rook b8 the black king was on c6, but Euwe answered with bishop g7 nonetheless. Now came rook b5 check. It's a matter of technique from here in any case, and as usual Fischer conducts the endgame with great precision. Euwe moved his king to c6, and now there was a repeated position with rook b6 check and king d5, but Fischer had now decided on a plan and played a5, and Euwe tried to get some play with his own pawns through f5, and now came another nice move, bishop b8, threatening to win the f5 pawn with rook d6 check, and also creating a position where black isn't defending the important a8 square, considering this passed pawn has interrupted the rook's defense of that square, and now white is getting a big advantage, nearly 2 pawns up objectively speaking, and to make matters worse Euwe now played an inferior move with rook c8, trying to get counterplay on white's c-pawn, but now the position favours white even more at nearly 4 pawns up. Fritz thinks better here was rook d8, and the line he gives goes king c2, rook c8, rook b5 check, rook c5, rook takes c5, king takes c5, but white still has a winning advantage thanks to the a pawn. So rook c8 anyway. Now came a6, passed pawns must be pushed, and rook takes c3, which is a cheap shot really, you know, it's just trying to take some prisoners before the war's finally finished, but it's obviously leads to no counterplay really after rook b5 check, which leads to an easy winning line, but Fritz gave rook d6 check as significantly stronger. But in any case, both lines lead to a forced win, and Fischer had probably found a route that he knew would work and stuck to it with rook b5 check. It's now king c4, and Fischer added here that after the game Euwe showed him a cute little trap and almost fainted when Fischer fell into it. That line goes if black plays instead here king c6, where the best move for white is rook a5, stopping any rook a3 ideas to hinder the advance of white's a pawn, and black's last hope is to sack his bishop on a7 by playing bishop d4 and sacking it, you know, if white plays a7. And in the post-mortem, Euwe asked Fischer what he would have played now, and the latter looked for a few seconds at the position and played bishop e5, hoping to divert the black bishop and queen the a pawn. But now black has rook c5, and the resulting position is drawn because rook takes c5 is forced, and now bishop takes c5, and black can draw this easily. So instead of bishop e5, the correct move was king e2, and now white has a winning game. And Fischer remarked, "It's these tidbits that you remember best." So anyway, the game continuation was king c4, and now Fischer played rook b7, threatening the bishop, and bishop d4 to defend a7 is logical. So again, what's the best move for white here? If you want to try and find it, then stop the video now. Rook c7 check is by far the best move and leads to a one game. If instead rook takes h7, then black is off the hook with rook a3, and again the position is drawn. And this is the kind of thing that you have to be very careful about in the endgame. So rook c7 check, and king d3 is best. If instead bishop c5, then bishop a7 forces king b5, but now rook takes c5 check, rook takes c5, bishop takes c5, and king takes a6 prolongs the agony for a while, but of course it's still lost for black. So king d3, and now rook takes c3 check. Again, if instead rook takes h7, now comes rook a3, threatening mate with rook a1, so rook c7 pretty much forced, but now rook takes a6, and suddenly it's black who has a winning game. So rook takes c3 and king takes c3 is forced, because if bishop takes c3, then the a pawn is queening. And now came a brilliant finishing touch from Fischer. Again, if you want to try and spot it, then stop the video now. Bishop e5 is the move, and now Euwe was forced to resign. Fritz gives this move a double exclamation mark. It's a great example of endgame tactics, because now there's no way for black to stop the a pawn because his bishop is pinned. His best move is of course bishop takes e5, but now a7, and the bishop won't last long against the queen. So that's it anyway, another great game from Bobby Fischer. As usual, he makes it look very easy, but if it was really as easy as he makes it look, then we'd all be world champions, so it's obviously not the case. But anyway, I hope you enjoyed that game. Please leave any comments or thoughts. Thanks very much.